Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am Dr. Mitzi Smith, the host of Womanist Dialogues, and I am proud, especially after the recent work of our Board of Trustees, to be the J. Davison Phillips Professor of New Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary. Yay! We're so grateful for their breach, their repairing the breach work that they've done already at Columbia Theological Seminary. Our topic this evening is the book of Revelation / Apocalypse, a critical discussion in light of COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter. The book of Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse, is known as apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature can develop among or for oppressed, marginalized, and or colonized peoples who are subjected to perceived, real, and or anticipated injustices and oppressions. In apocalyptic literature, prophets, or also known as seers, because they state what it is they see in vision, receive revelations from a divine being, and through visions, they journey between earth and heaven. Communities to whom the literature is addressed are often complimented for what they are doing well or right, and chastised for how they fall short. The literature encourages perseverance, faith, hope, and hope for an eschatological, that is, a redemption at the end, in the last day, justice and renewal. It makes use of symbolic imagery and language, not unlike our modern sci-fi movies. And like a sci-fi movie, we discover plenty of violence, including wars. Revelation is a biblical text that many faith communities have attempted to decode as if it was written to Christians in the modern period, but it was not. It is a book is the book, my question is, of any earthly good to us as modern readers? How does it speak to God's revelation in or through human readers today, to our responsibility to each other as human beings and as God's creation? We must critique and determine what is helpful to think about in the present and in the future as we read biblical texts. How can we read Revelation from a perspective or a perspective of oppressed or marginalized groups? How do we place Revelation in dialogue with the lived realities of Black women and men, people of color, and or women generally? Can Revelation be inspirational for modern racial ethnic groups and or faith communities or not? Does it offer any relevant critique of our churches and religious institutions and or paradigms for overcoming systemic injustice? In Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 through 10, the seer states, quote, "When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slaughtered for the word of God and for the testimony they had given. They cried out with a loud voice, 'Sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long will it be before you judge and avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth?' Who are the tormented souls waiting for justice today? We might mention Sandra Bland, Trayvon Martin, Corinne Gaines, Kayla Moore, Tatiana Jefferson, Tamir Rice, Michelle Cusseau, Natasha McKinnon, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, and so many more. In Revelation 21, verses 1 through 2, the seer says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, unquote. Are we to wait for the descent of a new earth from heaven in the by and by? Or does God expect us to dismantle poverty, racism, sexism, and other oppressions to create a paradise where we live, work, play, and worship? In Atlanta, Minneapolis, Chicago, Detroit, Boston, Baltimore, San Francisco, and so forth? There is no one way, one legitimate way, no one legitimate way to read biblical texts. And our panelists will demonstrate that in terms of the book of Revelation this evening. So I will introduce our panelists in the order in which they will speak, and then they will present. But first, I'd like to say that our academic dean at Columbia Theological Seminary, Dr. Love Seacrest, could not be with us tonight because her husband is, for one, he is recuperating from surgery, and she just recently found out that she has tested positive for COVID-19. So we will definitely, please keep her in your prayers, her and her family and thoughts. And we will have a prayer for her at the end of our session today. So our panelists, beginning with Dr. Sheila Winborne. If you would wave your hand so people can put the name with the face. Dr. Sheila Winborne is the Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religion at Northeastern University. I'm sorry, I was seeing someone's picture on the screen. Okay, so back on track. So Dr. Sheila Winborne is Associate Teaching Professor in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Northeastern University. Her publications include, quote, The Power to Name, Define, and Represent, Exploring Influences from a Study of Religion Perspective. She teaches a popular Northeastern University course entitled Apocalypticism and Film, unquote. Yes, I'm sorry. Dr. Shanell T. Smith is the Associate Professor of New Testament and Christian Origins at Hartford Seminary. Her publications include The Woman Babylon, The Marks of Empire, Reading Revelation with a Post-Colonial Womanist Hermeneutics of Ambivalence. Her most recent book is Touched, for survivors of sexual assault like me who have been hurt by church folk and for those who will care. Dr. Tina Pippin is the Wallace M. Alston Professor of Bible and Religion at Agnes Scott College down the street from Columbia. Her publications include Death and Desire, The Rhetoric of Gender and the Apocalypse of John, and Violence. In Apocalypse of John, and the second book she mentions that I will mention is Violence, Utopia, and the Kingdom of God, Fantasy and Ideology in the Bible. Dr. Raj Nadella is my colleague at Columbia Theological Seminary. He is the Samuel A. Cartledge Associate Professor of New Testament. His publications include Dialogue, Not Dogma, Many Voices in the Gospel of Luke, and currently he is co-editing a forthcoming volume entitled Christianity and the Law of Migration. And I understand that is a compilation of essays by religious scholars and lawyers, correct? Or legal scholars. Dr. Thomas Slater, I don't know if he's in the room yet. I have not seen him yet. He is a professor emeritus at McAfee School of Theology. Yes, he recently, here he is coming in the room now. All right. Dr. Thomas Slater is professor emeritus at the McAfee School of Theology at Mercer University. His publications include his latest, I think one of his latest is Revelation as Civil Disobedience, Witness Not Warriors, and John's Apocalypse. Let me apologize to my helpers here. I thought I was getting better at this Zoom thing, and I forgot to make them co-hosts so that they could help me. That's why I've been busy juggling these two tasks here and letting people in the room, and I just now figured out why. Okay, so we will start with Dr. Sheila Winborne, and then we will go with Dr. Smith and Dr. Hidalgo.
Okay, so I'll begin by showing a set of film clips, which include just a few of the numerous ways religious and other themes historically have been and continue to be represented in apocalyptic themed popular films. Sometimes these films borrow directly from the biblical book of Revelation. After the clips, I'll share brief statements about how films function as cultural text, followed by a short list of reoccurring themes that often appear in these apocalyptic films.
Hon talar om yttersta dagen. Och nog är det hemskt med alla hjärtecken.
Yttersta dagen går mot kväll. Änglarna stiger ner och gravarna öppnas. Det blir hemskt att se.
My father said that one day, if man continued in his ways, the Creator would annihilate this world. It begins.
It's not an easy thing to meet your maker. Look at you. You're the prodigal son. You're quite a prize. I've done questionable things, also extraordinary things. Revel in your time. Nothing the god of biomechanics wouldn't let you in heaven.
I'll kill you. I'll take the book.
Why? Why do you want it?
I grew up with it. I know its power. And if you read it, then so do you. That's why they burned them all after the war. That's just staying alive is an act of faith. Building this town is an even bigger act of faith, but they don't understand that. None of them. And I don't have the right words to help them, but the book does.
did what I had to do.
I think anything could make you give up that book. I thought it was too important.
You know, all the years I've been carrying it and reading it every day. I got so caught up with keeping it safe, I forgot to live by what I learned from it.
Yeah, what's that?
Just do for others more than you do for yourself.
Is it a man?
Sir, perhaps the question is the point at issue. Is he a man? Is he deviant or a freak of nature?
Objection. Sustained now, Dr. Zira. In all fairness, you must admit that the accused is a non-ape and therefore has no rights under ape law.
Then why is he called the accused? Your honors must think him guilty of something.
He's not being tried, he's being disposed of.
This is what I've seen in the 4 weeks since infection. People killing people. Which is much what I saw in the 4 weeks before infection and the 4 weeks before that and before that, as far back as I care to remember, people killing people. Which to my mind puts us in a state of normality right now.
If you look at the whole life of the planet, man, has only been around for a few blinks of an eye. So if the infection wipes us all out, that is a return to normality.
Okay, so let me tell you a few things about film. Film is a cultural, storytelling, or myth-telling medium. Although the stories that are told through film are not literally true, they do contain a type of truth, as stories that tell something about a community or a society of believers, about their values, their ethics, and their morals. Although there are increasingly more exceptions still today, exceptions to what I'm about to say. Still today, the majority of films made and distributed through the Hollywood system continue to be told from the point of view of white male main characters or protagonists. Apocalyptic films often reflect major concerns and discontents of the time periods in which they were released. These films include viewers' worldviews and sometimes include prophetic warnings about possible future ways that we might live. Films contain various messages about what it means to be defined as fully human, compared to what it means to be defined as the other or not human. Films represent the vast divides between the ways we believe that we should live as a species versus the ways we actually do live, and how this divide can often lead to apocalyptic situations. In other words, the utopian dreams of the powerful often lead to the dystopian nightmares of the oppressed. For example, in D.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation, this film was created as a reaction to white Southern American fears during the post-Civil War and Jim Crow eras. Included in this film are stereotypical representations of African Americans, the Ku Klux Klan as heroic, and the film ended with Griffith's American version of the second coming of Jesus, in which only European Americans were represented as among God's faithful, new chosen people. Griffith's representation of the future embodied a concept of American exceptionalism that dates back to 1630 sermon in which the Puritan settler John Winthrop declared that he and others of the Massachusetts Bay Colony had a covenant with God and were to develop a city on a hill as referenced in the Gospel of Matthew. An apocalypse is an ancient concept, which was and continues to be embraced in a diversity of ways within organized faith traditions and other forms of culture. Many tend to think of an apocalypse as only about the ultimate clash between good and evil that results in total annihilation of our world as we know it. Although this is often part of the way that an apocalypse is represented through film, It also is often represented within nuanced approaches to a revelation, an uncovering, or conscious awakening about something that was previously hidden or less obvious, about what it means to be human during times of great change and tragedy. Apocalypticism is equally about the end of a time and the beginning of a new time. It's about death and resurrection, destruction and rebirth. There is the concept of a type of romanticizing or mourning for what was lost, as well as the hope that what follows may result in a more fruitful rebuilding of ways of living. These films are about power dynamics first and foremost, and how as humans we often repeat the same mistakes over and over again and again. A few of the often reoccurring themes within Western apocalyptic films are fear of God's wrath and judgment during the apocalypse as described in the book of Revelation. For example, in The Seventh Seal, whose title is taken directly from the book of Revelation, the filmmaker Ingmar Bergman shows how characters believe that because of God's sins, the one all-powerful God as creator is again not pleased with most of the created and is annihilating most of humanity through a type of genocide, as had previously been the case in the story of Noah. Another reoccurring theme is destruction of institutionalized systems. For example, in The Seventh Seal, as well as in Danny Boyle's zombie film 28 Days Later, it is religion and its institutionalized Christian forms that are shown as not remaining intact as places of salvation. But a close read of 28 Days Later uncovers the suggestion that even in a world where one is threatened by zombies, there still may be hope through personal spirituality. In the book of Eli, a film by Albert and Alan Hughes, a man named Eli, whose name reflects that of a prophet of the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians refer to as the Old Testament, answers God's call to recover the last surviving Christian Bible and to carry it west to a safe place. Eli has the faith to answer the call, but only consciously realizes near the end of his journey that he got so caught up in protecting the Bible as an object of the faith that he forgot to live by the core messages of the faith. In Blade Runner, a film by Ridley Scott, we're exposed to how one person's capitalistic utopian dream that included having godlike powers to create a new bio-robotic android slave system called replicants that are marketed as more human than human, turned into a dystopian nightmare. Blade Runner warns how through biological science and technology, humans often create what in their end they cannot or do not have the collective will to control, and therefore no longer live in a world where only the all-powerful God as creator can destroy the creation. Although not represented in the previous film clips that I showed you, an additional often reoccurring theme is the attempt at violent control by men over women's bodies. Women's bodies are often represented as objectified vessels for men or male viewing, sexual pleasure, and childbirth, particularly during the rebuilding period in post-apocalyptic worlds. The scholar Sarah Tribble describes such approaches as patriarchal survivalist fantasy. Also, there is symbolism of race divides as interrelated with systemic abuses of power and greed. For example, in Franklin J. Schaffner's Planet of the Apes, viewers are exposed to an upside down world meant to symbolize the racial divides of the 1960s. In this film, apes have power to define and use humans as slaves. And slavery is one of the main reoccurring themes throughout the apocalyptic genre or subgenre of films. Some of these films seem prophetic in relationship to contemporary major discontents and protests that call for systemic changes towards ending the interrelationships of race divides, unequal access to proper medical care, and economic divides that lead to racializing bodies, in particular in the history of Black bodies treated as disposable objects. Scholars such as Frank D. Wilderson III, Harry M. Bensoff, and Sean Griffin remind us in writings about cinema that films actively contribute to and reflect ways in which people are understood and experienced in our world. These films remind us that although in apocalyptic worlds, things always get worse before they get better, there still can be hope for more conscious and fruitful ways of living. Apocalypticism is not just about massive destruction at the end of an era. It is equally about the beginning of a new era where there is the possibility of wiser ways of creating and living. Still, the following questions loom. As a species, are we any wiser than our ancient and medieval ancestors? Also, in spite of our continuing efforts through science to expand our lifespans, why as a collective do we seem to be more easily able to collaborate in creating apocalyptic situations that suggests we may have a type of collective suicidal wish? And finally, now that we have the powers of mass destruction to just blow up our world at a moment's notice, and we have the abilities to create new life forms in ways that our ancient and medieval ancestors thought only possible by an all-powerful God, as the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche asked, is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? I'll turn it back over to Professor Smith.
You have to unmute yourself, Dr. Smith. Are you talking?
Excuse me. Our next presenter is Dr. Smith, and after Dr. Smith, Dr. Hidalgo, right? Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Smith, for your invitation to be on this panel with all of my esteemed colleagues and friends. I do apologize in advance as I may have to leave the discussion early, but I'm going to stay on as long as I can. I dreaded writing this. Every time I thought about beginning to write for this occasion, I shook my head no and did something else. Now, I dreaded writing this because I feel so raw and angry and helpless, exposed even, with regards to the emotions that I feel and those that have been evoked when thinking about or speaking on the topics of Black Lives Matter, hashtag say the name, COVID-19, and then some. It's just all too much. But alas, it is for times such as these that we must put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard and put our emotions and intellect on display in order to bring awareness, to compel others to act, and yes, to evoke change. This past week, I told my 13-year-old son that the police are not your friends. He asked me, what about the Black ones? I did not know how to respond to that because I also know that some people of color, their blood runs blue. This past week, my 8-year-old son said he was afraid because there were police cars outside in front of our house walking on our neighbor's property. They are people of color, and I was afraid too. This past week, in order to protect my mental health, I've had to limit and sometimes totally avoid social media and the news, which are filled with images, videos, hashtags, opinions, critical analyses, helplessness, absolute abjection, downright dejection, justified anger, stark silence by many non-melanated folk. I could go on. I've struggled with what to say, what to do, how to make sense of what doesn't make any sense. Kind of like the book of Revelation. Too many. It doesn't make any sense. It's too complicated. It's too confusing. It's just too much in terms of imagery, violence, the depiction of women, good versus bad, a hypersexualized God and an over-sexualized female called the whore, whom I refer to as the woman Babylon. Revelation, the last book in the New Testament canon, was written by a man named John, an itinerant prophet who was not the apostle. John's message in Revelation was clear. You must choose. You are either with God or against God. You are either for the Roman Empire or against it. Putting words in the mouth of God, he says that the church in Laodicea will be spit out of the mouth of God because, quote, they are lukewarm and are neither cold nor hot. Chapter 3, verse 16. Choose sides, John says. There is no room for uncertainty, no place for indecision, no need for ambiguity. You are either with God or you are with the Roman Empire. You either want to live or you will die. Interesting choices. In my book, The Woman Babylon and the Marks of Empire, Reading Revelation with a Post-Colonial Womanist Hermeneutics of Ambivalence, I argue that in doing a critical analysis of the woman Babylon's text in Revelation 17, I found a representation of myself. The woman Babylon, I assert, is no ordinary woman. Revelation 17:4 says, the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup. Dressed by John, she represents Roman imperial power that will be destroyed and overtaken by God's empire. Now, simultaneously, she is marked on her forehead with an inscription that states, Babylon the Great, mother of whores and of earth's abominations. Although markings on the body, such as tattoos and branding, were commonplace in antiquity, in the case of the woman Babylon, the mark of ownership on her forehead is linked to the profession of prostitution, based on the understanding of the Greek word porne as brothel slave. So she is both empress, imperial city, and brothel slave, kind of making me want to hug her and slap her at the same time. Representing empire with its domineering tactics, oppressive ideology, and inclination toward excess, I detest her. And whatever judgment she has coming to her, I hope she gets. But at the same time, denoting a female slave violently abused and regarded as unable, I know her and I empathize with her plight.
Shanell, you're freezing up on us.
All that woman Babylon represents are recognizable in me. Because of my particular cultural context. Can you all hear me?
No, we've basically lost you.
I tell you, the devil is a liar. Can you hear me now?
I can now.
Okay, I'll go back just a little bit. So I was saying that the woman Babylon is both an empress, imperial city, and a brothel slave, making me want to hug her and slap her at the same time. Mm-hmm. Now, representing empire with its domineering tactics, oppressive ideology, and inclination toward excess, I detest her, and whatever judgment she has coming her way, I hope she gets. But at the same time, denoting a female slave violently abused and regarded as utterly dispensable, I also know her story, and I empathize with her plight. And it's sobering how, just like I wrote the book before, traces of the woman Babylon still represent parts of me. They're recognizable in me. Mm-hmm. Because of my particular cultural context, her being branded on the forehead, declaring her a whore, resonates racially with me. It reminds me of American slavery that enslaved my ancestors, including my great-great-grandmother, Indiana Grant, and the effects of it that remain. Additionally, like the woman Babylon, I am highly emplaced. As a privileged Black woman, I have individual educational privilege, but I also benefit from other structural privileges, such as home ownership, safety, private transportation, etc. Approaching the text of the woman Babylon initiated a process of self-realization. To my surprise, what began as a comprehensive examination of her duality resulted in a disclosure of mine, a revelation indeed. Although I describe myself as simultaneously a participant in and victim of empire, it does not render me neutral. One does not cancel out the other. In fact, it should move me, and it does move me to action. Since I know what it feels like to be oppressed, to be racially profiled, to be treated as if I am nothing, and because I have access to platforms such as these, being here with you all, money to put into causes and to give to organizations working to change this racist, patriarchal system in which we live, I seek to use the former to inform the latter. I seek to use my state of oppression to inform how to eradicate oppressive systems. Yes, I see myself in the character of the woman Babylon. I too am simultaneously a participant in and a victim of empire, my empire being these United States of America. But what about today? Has anything changed? Has the scale tipped over in terms of my being a victim more than a participant in empire, or vice versa? In light of COVID-19, yes, it has. I am definitely more like a participant in empire than a victim of the very same structure. Why? Because I have access to healthcare. I have health insurance for me and my family in case we need a doctor appointment, money to purchase prescriptions, the ability to shelter in place comfortably, and food and drink without the fear of not being able to purchase more. Your privilege shines brightly when you realize that your fear of not being able to buy toilet paper is based on whether the store ran out and not because you don't have the money to get it. COVID-19 has amplified my privilege. It has indeed tipped the scales over to the side of abundance, my victimhood by empire barely carrying any weight. Perhaps I should reconsider my argument. Should I write another book, updating it to say that John was correct? That I've seen the error of my ways, and just like the woman Babylon, representing imperial city Rome, I too have gotten greedy? Have I become overly excessive in how I live, but also what I buy and how much I take? Should I accept John's censure that I will be judged by God for being lukewarm, for speaking out against the injustice of inequality and inequity in terms of resources for everyone, as I simultaneously hoard resources to provide for my family? In light of COVID-19, yes. Yes, I should, because I am guilty. If only it were that simple. It isn't, because I am a person of color living in a pandemic within a pandemic. I can breathe easy in terms of having to update my book because there's no reason to do so. You see, the scale holding my participation in and victimization of empire is held in balance by the fact that I am a Black woman with beautiful Black sons and husband. I should say more accurately that the scale has tipped over to my side of victimization. And as the hashtag say her name suggests, even my gender doesn't protect me from the disgusting hatred, evil, violence by white nationalists, white supremacists, and white folk that don't self-identify as such, but smile in your face while donning invisible hoods by the KK, okay? wealth, and access to resources that privileged persons of color may have may be good for dealing with COVID-19, but it does nothing, absolutely nothing, for protecting us from being victims of hate crimes. My privileged status might look good on paper. My address, education, credit scores, all of that. They will get me a second look for a job, right? But I will not get a second look, another consideration, a pause for the possibility that my Black body is worth living. COVID-19, participant in empire. Black Lives Matter, say her name, victim of empire. Yet again, I see the two aspects of my single identity, just like I did in that of the woman Babylon in Revelation 17. So no, while I don't believe it is the end times, with everything that is going on, however, with living within a pandemic, in a pandemic within a pandemic, I can only hope that the words said at the end of Revelation are true. Surely I come quickly. Come, God, and do something. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Smith. Dr. Hidalgo.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mitzi Smith, again, for organizing this. And these Womanist dialogues are such a great service that you're offering right now. And I'm honored to have been invited and a bit intimidated by the many great scholars on this panel and also in the Zoom audience. Whose words I really can't wait to listen to. And it was wonderful listening to Dr. Shanell Smith's right now. First, a reading from a not apocalypse. Quote, "The end is near, or has it come and gone before? Why can we imagine the ending of the world, yet not the ending of colonialism? We live the future of a past that is not our own. It is a history of utopian fantasies and apocalyptic idealization. It is a pathogenic global social order of imagined futures built upon genocide, enslavement, ecocide, and total ruination. It is an apocalyptic that colonizes our imaginations and destroys our past and future simultaneously. It is a struggle to dominate human meaning and all existence," end quote. I wanted to start with a few excerpts from Rethinking the Apocalypse, an Indigenous Anti-Futurist Manifesto, which was distributed by indigenousaction.org on March 19th, 2020. As apocalyptic visions and meditations proliferated in these past few months, I found myself returning to this manifesto because it raised so many critical themes about how the apocalypse, as a mythic frame and a temporal structure, have been mobilized to justify imperial, settler colonial, genocidal, ecocidal, and enslaving violence historically. And I don't want there to be a chance that we forget that history tonight, even as I really want to give space to other readings of Revelation, which I'll say more about in a minute. I'm grateful for the summary of the book that Dr. Mitzi Smith that you provided in your opening remarks, because I'm not that interested in making meaning out of Revelation itself. I am interested in the ways, the whys, and the hows of people making meaning with and around the book of Revelation. How do people engage this text and why? Those questions are why in my first book, I trace the legacies of the utopian strain of the apocalypse and Chicano movement activism in the 1960s and 70s. And I was interested not only in how they read Revelation, but also how they created and read their own texts, writing their own future text, so to speak. Like Dr. Shanell Smith, I also struggled writing these remarks tonight. I should also say that in these times, I've grown weary of the apocalypse, in part because of how many people engage with the text as a struggle to control meaning. So I want to pass a few minutes highlighting interpretations, not my own, but ones that have inspired me and how they refuse to control meaning. and how they look at this difficult and multivalent text, not for definitive answers or for an end to meaning. Instead, they see a space for meditation on the whys of our ambivalence as minoritized interpreters living in the space of empire. But I also want to say something else about these readings. They speak to me in this moment because of my own freighted and ambiguous positionality. And I don't presume that they are readings that would or should resonate with everyone, or even that I've understood the interpretations the same way others might. I want to say a couple things about what these readings have in common. They do generally situate Revelation within its historical context in the 1st century CE, describing it as a text produced within minoritized communities living under Roman imperial domination. They do not read the text looking for literal signs of the end of the world in our present, but nor do they treat the past as an objective field neatly disentangled from our present. It is instead a construction. So they read Revelation in a fashion that is critically aware of themselves and our present, as Dr. Shanell Smith so well demonstrated in her reading right now, just before me. Most of these interpreters respond to a scholarly realm of post-colonial biblical criticism that has been dominated by questions of how Revelation critiques the Roman Empire and whether the apocalypse replicates Roman logics of power and how it imagines God as a bigger Caesar, and in the violence it visits upon the woman Babylon. Lynn St. Clair Darden, in her work Scripturalizing Revelation, pointed to Revelation's production within the Roman Empire as meaning that we need to approach it as a text of empire, even as it is a text against empire. It's a hybrid text, born in that empire, and thus not quite capable of escaping its logics. She argued, quote, thus, it is imperative for a marginalized community to be aware of the possibility of reinscribing the oppressive elements of their own contemporary society, end quote. For Darden, readers should not succumb to the easy triumphalism imperialists often map onto the apocalypse, seeing themselves as the divine victors in a clear-cut war between good and evil. In a similar vein, I think my fellow panelist, Dr. Shanell Smith, just offered up a profound spin on these questions by focusing precisely on the woman Babylon and not reading Revelation in a simple either or fashion. In her work, she has described the book of Revelation in one of my favorite short little assessments as a masculinist minority report, which I really enjoy. And she treats Revelation as a mirror, as she pointed out, with which to grapple with her own complex positionality through the hermeneutics of ambivalence. She's already done a great job of talking about that tonight, but I wanted to point out its resonance also with Lynn Huber's work, where, like Dr. Smith, Dr. Huber focuses on the woman Babylon and reads her in a minoritized key, though this time in a queer hermeneutical perspective. Huber, like Smith, sees a disturbing vision in the judgment of Babylon, a vision critical of empire, to be sure, but also troubling in the violence it enacts on a figure who can be read as queer, femme, and a victim of empire as much as a representative of it. For Dr. Huber, this vision, though, reminds us of a need to be cautious about how much we may have already internalized the dreams of empire, even when we are most critical of it. Mm-hmm. During this unending roller coaster of our present, where the violence of US imperial power seems to be crashing down, where the meaning control is enacted for so long seems to be slipping, Revelation has been reinvigorated on the left as a space for reflective insight that lifts up the violent inequities of the United States. In the past few months, well over 100,000 people in the United States have died, and we may never know exactly how many, whether to the virus of COVID-19, or, as I'm sure all of you already know, to the pandemic of anti-Black racism that has made African-American communities especially more vulnerable to police brutality and a broken healthcare system. As Dr. Mitzi Smith pointed out in her opening remarks, it can be easy to turn to Revelation and see all those who have died, whether it be from COVID-19, as victims of police violence, or as protesters beaten and tear gassed. We can see all of those as a cloud of witnesses whose blood cries out for vengeance. And in that vein, on June 12th, Miguel H. Diaz, a Cuban-American theologian who served as ambassador to the Holy See under President Obama, returned to Revelation's call for faithful witness. He wrote a short piece titled Calling Out Our Own that started with Revelation 6:9 through 10, which Dr. Smith quoted in her opening remarks. But instead he takes a cue from Dr. Shanell Smith's hermeneutics of ambivalence. And he reminds us that even as we take to the streets demanding that Black lives matter, too many of us minoritized folks have participated in the workings of empire and the perpetuation of anti-Black racism. Diaz describes how 40 years ago, a Cuban-American police officer was among those charged in the murder of Arthur McDuffie in Miami. He connects that past moment to our present, where among police officers stood silent despite George Floyd's pleas. Here again, the apocalypse has served as a mirror, not a literal reflection of our present, but a space with which to reflect on the cracks in our present. The common thread that ties Dr. Diaz's readings to the others I've examined is a self-critical reading that seeks ways to undo the workings of human domination without presuming to have the final answer. Now, these are clearly not the only ways people have read the apocalypse, and they certainly aren't the norms that have been so well delineated in texts like Rethinking the Apocalypse, an Indigenous Anti-Futurist Manifesto. But I think I wanted to offer them up because they turn to the apocalypse as a mirror, and they offer it as a space of pause, even though the apocalypse itself seems to rush at us with so many vivid visions and revelations. But I think their readings remind us that while this moment is urgent, the revelations of the pandemic nature of racism, colonialism, capitalism, cis-heteropatriarchy, ableism, these revelations aren't new. They're not new to many of us, most of us on this Zoom meeting. Given these recycled revelations, I'm drawn to those who read the apocalypse this time, not for its visions of endings, but rather for a place that opens up ways of making complex and diverse meanings, of making possible the Zapatista maxim of a world where many worlds fit, even as we continue to struggle against the violence of imperial meaning domination. Maybe the apocalypse this time will follow in the steps of the Indigenous Anti-Futurist Manifesto and turn to the wisdom of, quote, ancestors who dreamt against the end of the world, end quote. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Dr. Here we go. Okay, oh, I am on. Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Hidalgo. Thank you so much. So we'll go to Dr. Tina Pippin.
Forgot about that. Thank you all. This is helping me with my endless struggle with this text. And so I have lately been looking at this text as a map of the past, present, and future. And so I'm going to use that map in imagery in my remarks tonight. As we know, many biblical scholars just ignore the Apocalypse of John or the Book of Revelation, and even mispronounce it, put a final S on it, Revelations, which it may be plural, however. But we here, as well as other Apocalypse of John scholars, stand and are face to face with this text. And that's scary. It's a text of terror, the ultimate text of terror, I think. And so it's a I'm going to be, once again, a bit of a naysayer about this canonical text and question its place and where it's taking us in terms of it being a map. I think it represents a deity hell-bent on destroying creation. And I think there are various ways of that. I also want to talk about the apocalypse in the simile of it's like the coronavirus for me. It latches on in various unpredictable ways. And I think the Apocalypse of John, Book of Revelation, is in itself a pandemic about the end of time and the violence of a ruthless deity. So I think it also, and I'm drawing on Shanell's work here, I think I want to ask what is being unveiled, revealed in the Book of Revelation, and does it ultimately reveal, or is that ambivalence that Shanell talks about, social justice issues? Because as we talk about Black Lives Matter and the various pandemic upon pandemic, I want to raise the question of where does this text take us? Where does this map of this text take us with its many monsters and its othering of anything that is not seen as in John's community? So I want to talk about also the text and its afterlives that have been talked about so far in film and other things. But as the ultimate text of terror, it reflects and reveals a lot of today's politics and the terrifying nature of today's politics. People have mentioned the nuclear issue, their chemical warfare and chemical issues, pandemics, plural, environmental issues of mass extinction, global warming, etc., the inconvenient truths of all that the New Jerusalem in its purified monoculture does not comfort me on. We've talked about white supremacy and racism, colonialism, genocide, misogyny, and patriarchy. I think in various ways, anachronistically in terms of nuclear and other things, since the apocalypse is about the utter destruction of the world and God's own creation, it mirrors its own issues of misogyny, patriarchy, genocide, etc. I also want to raise the issue of this text being a narcissistic text in terms of concerning the destruction of humans and not the destruction of trees and animals and biodiversity and other things. And I also think perhaps that reflects in terms of the character of God in this text and other apocalyptic texts, including, the flood story, a narcissistic deity. And is this deity not a tyrant? And how do we respond to that as we are, facing a narcissistic president, excuse me, of the United States right now? So I ask the question, who is this deity or deities, plural, in the Apocalypse of John? Warrior kings with warrior armies. And I think there is contemporary music and contemporary film, and I'm thinking of one particular song that I play in my Politics of Apocalypse class by this mysterious group called The Residents in their biblical CD called Wormwood. They have an instrumental track called Revelation, and they take you through the text in some really, really interesting ways. They capture the horror, even in the part of the New Jerusalem, which I think is instructive. So all of us on this panel are somehow bound by this text and bound by this book and its fears, its promises, its hope, its call to action, its, the mess of all that and what to make of that. And so I want to make it more current in my own context, because I think when we're dealing with this authoritarian deity, you know, and the apocalyptic God, you know, I wonder, what is this God going to do in the New Jerusalem? And are the 144,000 and the 24 elders around the throne his lackeys, maintaining his power? I'm thinking of, you know, Bolton's book, etc. This just come out. And I'm led to, you know, my own campus that has put up these wonderful signs, you know, about how much we care about Black lives, while we pay poverty wages to Black and brown people who work on our campus, who cook and mow and clean and are the wise bearers of the history of my small liberal arts college. We share the mowing and the policing with Columbia Theological Seminary, Raj and Mitzi. We outsource the mowing. And so at $8.50 an hour. Anyway, so, and that varies. But I'm led to one of my own interests because of our very first religion and social justice major. Now, Dr. Colleen Wessel McCoy, she got her doctorate in Christian social ethics at Union Theological Seminary and works at the Cairo Center and with the Poor People's Campaign with Reverend Liz Thea Harris and Dr. William Barber. Now, William Barber is from, speaking of maps, he is from Eastern North Carolina. His church is in Goldsboro, North Carolina. And I grew up just down the road in a very small town. And this is a very poor rural part of the state, about 2 hours east of civilization, which we call Raleigh, North Carolina. And so I feel a kind of an affinity, you know, because of that, and because I am part of the Living Wage campaign on my campus. So when I see these Black Lives Matter, I want to go, well, no, they don't, you know. And what is this? This apocalypse of John is somehow pushing me forward as I resist the text. So I'm looking at the demands from the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And, you know, these are the things that are one of our great leaders in Georgia, Stacey Abrams, and others are pushing for, which is, you know, protect and expand the right to vote, have consequences and acknowledgement of police abuse and justice for families and communities, demilitarize police and end mass incarceration, stop criminalizing the poor. And I'm thinking of, you know, the Equal Justice Initiative down in Mobile, taking care of health needs in COVID-19 and beyond, especially in communities of poverty, and working with frontline movements, impacted communities, and establish a national truth commission on the violence of systemic racism. So these are some of the demands that the Poor People's Campaign has. And I want to take these demands to the Book of Revelation and the throne room and say, you know, I demand equal justice in this misogynist male fantasy of the end of time. So thinking of, you know, I rewatched an apocalyptic film. Well, I think it's apocalyptic because it represents apocalypse as past, present, and future. And that's the documentary by Ava DuVernay that was nominated for an Oscar, I think 2016, 13th. And tracing, you know, the 13th Amendment and the history of what happened in Reconstruction, Jim Crow, New Jim Crow, the prison industrial complex, mass incarceration, etc. And the prison system replacing slavery. And, you know, I'm thinking about the legacies of that. And having grown up in Eastern North Carolina, working in tobacco fields as, working class person, but seeing, sharecropping and other things in the late 1960s. Sort of what Flannery Connor says, we're in a Christ-haunted landscape. I think we're in an apocalypse-haunted landscape. Mm-hmm. And so that legacy of slavery, we're dragging it around on our campus when we do not respect and pay and acknowledge and share power democratically with our colleagues who cook, clean, mow, and care. So back to the map. What do you do when you're on this map of apocalypse with all its monsters and its othering of all the monsters? So where is this map taking us? We walk with John through a trail of politics of war, destruction, exclusion, to see a gated community we might not be eligible for or even desire to enter. Well, I'm speaking for myself, but then I grew up Episcopalian, so we don't really, we don't belong in there anyway, probably. I imagine another map in my New Revised Standard Version Bible, coming right after the journeys of the Apostle Paul. This map of Revelation is a jolt of violence and taps into our worst fears of death and of apocalypse. It is not the map of any future I want to happen to the earth or to its inhabitants. There is no way home, for home has been eclipsed and replaced by God. And I think Revelation thrives in these afterlives of extreme prejudice, war, and dreams of annihilation. I mean, look at Left Behind series, just one example, right? And its endless iterations that are misogynist and white supremacist and American essentialism and all that. The biblical map sets the tone for maps to follow. From medieval world maps, the Eurocentric colonial world maps, dispensational maps of the end time, to the nuclear maps of the Cold War, to the drone maps that we see in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. All of these maps have a connective thread with a geopolitical authoritative vision. What if we redraw the map, reimagining John's exclusionary, patriarchal, misogynistic, eco-genocidal, apocalyptic spaces, and refuse the inevitability of biblical prophecy? I see the book of Revelation as a palimpsest. No matter how much I scrape the vellum and overwrite another story or stories, John's story continues to reemerge through the layers. The apocalyptic unconscious is what I carry. I've ingested the scroll and it is bitter.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Pippin. Okay, so we go with Dr. Nadella.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Mitzi Smith, for inviting me to be part of this panel. I am really honored to be included in this, especially because I'm with all these experts on the book of Revelation, amazing scholars and experts on the book of Revelation. I'm more of a gospel person. Like Dr. Tina Pippin, I have struggled with this book, and an image that comes to my mind is similar to the one that she used, which is a mirror, a Revelation, the book of Revelation as a mirror that not only reflects some of the ugly aspects of the empire at the time, but a mirror type of a magnifying glass that when we look at sheds light on the ugly aspects of our own times, of my own context. Mm-hmm. My first serious engagement with the book of Revelation came around 2008. This was around the time when, you may recall, when the stock market was crashing really rapidly. It's in this context that I looked at Revelation chapter 18. I was looking at the two different voices in chapter 18. The first voice in 18 describes in some really disturbing ways the economic apocalypse that is taking place in and around the city of Rome. The economic apocalypse or economic meltdown taking place in and around Rome is actually a twofold crisis in this chapter. First, there is this supposedly vibrant city that is suddenly going up in flames. Something like the pandemic is taking place in the city of Rome at this time. But the second aspect of the crisis, which is what I'm a little more interested in, has to do with the plight of the merchants in this chapter. Revelation 18 actually talks about three groups of people. Craig Koster and others have talked about it. Three groups of people: the kings, the merchants, and the people, the ordinary people. I look a little bit at the plight of the merchants in this chapter. They have shipload of goods, but no buyers. No buyers because so far they have been doing business with the city of Rome. Rome had been their only buyer. It was a centripetal economic system that moved goods from the margins of the society, margins of the Roman Empire, to the center of the Roman Empire, the city of Rome. Aristides talks about it in the Eulogy to Rome. I quote, "So many merchants arrive here with cargoes from all over at every season, and with each return of the harvest, that the city seems like the common warehouse of the world that was the destination of all the goods produced all the other parts of the world." So this was a centripetal economic system that perpetuated affluence at the center, but dire poverty at the margins of the Roman Empire. So what happens when Rome, the center of this empire, loses its ability to spend? Is what we are seeing in Revelation 18, which is when the rich stop spending, the economy collapses. You may have read already, there was this piece in the New York Times yesterday that talks about how the economy is currently tanking during this pandemic, because the people at the very top are actually refusing to spend the money that they already have. Mm-hmm. Either they have lost their ability to spend, or more likely, they are holding on to their wealth more tightly than ever before. Mm-hmm. This New York Times piece actually, which builds upon a study undertaken by economists at Harvard University, talks about how the top 25% of the people in American society are driving 50% of decline in the current spending. The poor are spending. The poor are continuing to spend. They receive the stimulus checks and they have spent all that. They have nothing left. So what we see in this story, in this New York Times piece, is the dangers of an economy that is built for the rich on the backs of the poor. Mm-hmm. Dangers of an economy that takes away the purchasing power of the poor and the middle class. So returning to the merchants in this, in Revelation chapter 18, I think as the text indicates, they wanted to earn wealth quickly. And to do that, they invested all their resources at the top of the society and sided with the powerful. The result was, when the powerful and the wealthiest refused to spend, they had no customers left. Ships full of goods, but no one to buy them. What if the merchants had invested more at the margins? What if the merchants had formed alliances with the poor people, the people who are being oppressed by the empire? Would they have had more customers in times of economic crisis? Would they have had more of a market when the rich were refusing to spend money because of pandemic or whatever else was happening there? So Revelation 18, I think, on a primary level, is a critique of the role of the merchants. But it's also a critique of how these merchants participated in the dehumanizing practices of the empire. 1813 talks about how they were buying and selling human beings, and by doing so, they were treating people as goods. Mm-hmm. So that's the first voice in Revelation 18 that talks about the economic apocalypse that is taking place and how the merchants actually were participating in it. Interestingly, what this chapter says is that even as the collapse is taking place, economic collapse is taking place, the kings and the wealthiest people, they're not impacted at all. They're actually standing afar and watching the crisis unfold, and maybe even having fun watching the merchants struggle through this crisis because they no longer have any market left. Mm. But there's a second voice in this chapter, beginning at 18:3, that is actually inviting my people, whoever they are, to come out of her, to come out of it, exultate. Mm-hmm. So who are my people? And what does coming out mean? Is it literal, metaphorical? I think it's metaphorical, but I'm more interested in the question of who are my people? It's in this particular context. And this actually is similar to what Dr. Shanell Smith was talking about earlier today, which is my own hybrid location. I am a person of color. I am an immigrant in the United States. And because of both these identities, I often identify among the oppressed within the United States. But the other side of it is I am also part of one of the most privileged immigrant communities, Indian Americans in the United States. Mm-hmm. As a part of this privileged immigrant community, I do have power. I do have access to resources. I do have some social clout, similar to the ways that Dr. Shanell Smith was talking about earlier. And so given my social location, when I read Revelation 18, one of the questions that I have is, what does the seer mean when he or she is asking my people to come out of the empire? How am I participating in the empire? What does it mean for me to come out of the empire? How am I participating in the whiteness and the oppression that whiteness perpetuates in the United States? Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about what he calls the malleability of whiteness. That is, whiteness is an identity marker, but whiteness in its attempt to retain power is also often inviting other groups to get close to it, not become part of it, but get close to it. And so many persons of color are drawn to the lure of whiteness, and they seek proximity to whiteness in the hope of acquiring the power that is associated with whiteness. I was thinking of a rally that Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, hosted when he came to the United States last year. This was this major rally in the city of Houston, some 50,000 people at this stadium. And Donald Trump was the guest of honor, right? Big surprise, Donald Trump and Narendra Modi getting together. And at one point in this rally, Donald Trump and Narendra Modi are holding hands, clasping hands, and they were calling it the bromance. And Donald Trump then goes to the microphone and he says, Indians are the ideal immigrants, and you are the kind of people that we want in this country, hardworking, smart, and everything else. And you won't believe it. I would have hoped that people in the audience would have been appalled by it. They weren't. They stood up and gave him an extended standing ovation. This was a clear example of people at the margins, people who consider themselves oppressed, people of color, being drawn to the lure of whiteness in the hope of benefiting from the power of the empire, which is whiteness in this particular country. So as I read Revelation 18, one of the questions for me is, how am I participating in whiteness? And how do I come out of it? And I ask myself this question because I do know that if I associate myself with whiteness, I might have temporary gains, but ultimately I have everything to lose. I am a person of color, and much like the merchants in Revelation chapter 18, if I invest myself at the center of the empire, the center will let me down when the crisis unfolds. And so the merchants would have been much better off if they had formed alliances at the margins. And I think in some ways, that is something that I as an Asian American, as an Indian American, I should be doing, looking more to the margins rather than allow myself to be drawn to the center or to the lure of whiteness. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nadella. Thank you. Okay, we're gonna have a lot to talk about when we get to it. All the presentations have been great. Okay, Dr. Thomas Slater. We need to see your video, sir.
Hello. Hello?
Yes, we cannot see you. We hear you, but we cannot see you.
I have no idea why.
I tried turning your video on for you, but I was unsuccessful.
Let me see.
So I think you're gonna have to do that.
I'll try this.
All right.
Okay, here we are. Good evening, everyone. I want to thank my friend, Dr. Mitzi Smith, for inviting me to be on this panel. I must admit, I do so with some degree of fear and trembling, but here we are. It's also been a delight to hear Dr. Shanell Smith's presentation. I've read her work, and it was just so good to hear her. And I appreciate Dr. Nadella's words too. They spoke to me as well. I have just published a monograph which goes at the book of Revelation somewhat differently from what the previous speakers have presented. My book is on Revelation as a form of civil disobedience. And in the book, I am addressing three fronts, and I look at three transformations that the book presents. First, I argue that the book is dated between 68 and 70. And I don't think I say so explicitly in the book, but I think that John's primary opponent is the Apostle Paul. Secondly, I speak of the book as addressing a regional repression. And the third thing I say in the book is I try to address the message of the book in contrast to the interpretations of the message of the book. Let me give you an example of that third thing. Dr. Pippin brought up the Left Behind series. The Left Behind series has a terrible interpretation of the book. A terrible interpretation. One of my MDiv students wrote a thesis on it a few years ago, and he looked at one of the volumes, and he's not a person of color, but he did discern that all the leading persons in that volume were Europeans or European Americans, and all the villains were persons of color. He noted that even when people of color were positive actors, they were always subordinate positive actors. The emphasis upon violence in the Left Behind series has no root in the book of Revelation. That's what I mean when I say I try to address the message of the book in contrast to the interpretation of the message. And then I identified three transformations, which I consider the three major transformations in Revelation. First and foremost, the lion is transformed into a lamb in Revelation 5. Secondly, the word Nike is transformed. Before the book of Revelation, it meant a victory in usually some military conquest. It meant a political victory where one overwhelmed or conquered one's opponent. But in the book of Revelation, it is almost always a victory through suffering. This is how Christ overcomes, and this is how Christians are admonished to overcome. And I also noted that nowhere in the book are Christians asked to take up arms. The third major transformation is the transformation of the word martyr. Before Revelation was written, it was a term to denote people who testified in a legal context. After Revelation, it denotes people who die for a cause. Now, one of the things I noted that is that both COVID-19, the pandemic, and also the Black Lives Matter movement are apocalyptic movements. Well, I should say the first is an apocalyptic event, the second is an apocalyptic movement. They both bring social change to bear upon the world, and not just American society, but on the world. I was watching BBC News the other day, and someone in Brazil was carrying a sign. I believe it said, Vidas Negras Importante, Black Lives Matter. This movement has spread far beyond our borders. And what I note is that essentially the same people who don't want to wear masks, who don't want to shelter in place, are the same people who are fighting race, who are fighting the social changes that Black people and other people want in American society. The fight against social changes that the pandemic brings, and the fight for social equality that Black Lives Matter bring, are being fought by people who are clinging on to privilege. Now, that also means that things will probably become worse before they get better. So in this sense, I think the days that we're living in are very apocalyptic. Like Dr. Shanell Smith, I would not say that the book of Revelation is a foretelling of what we're going through, but I think in this sense, the book is very, very apocalyptic. I would add that I appreciate what Dr. Winborne said. One of the recurring themes she brought up was the presence of hope in the movies and also in apocalyptic literature, which is very much present in the book of Revelation. The Blade Runner theme is where humans create something that they can't control. When she said that, I thought immediately of Battlestar Galactica in both its early and later lifetimes, where that's very, very true. Now, most of the speakers, many of the speakers, I should say, have brought up the negative images of women in the book of Revelation. And this negative image has been exploited just as the military imagery has been exploited. I hear you, Dr. Shanell Smith. You articulated some things in the book that I had not seen. And I'm aware that I hadn't seen them before, but I can't unsee them anymore. The images in the book of Revelation, which lead to the abuse and the negative things that happen in our communities and in our families, are more than unfortunate. They're horrific. And it is unfortunate that we find them in the book, to be quite honest. I would exhort you, though, that there are also positive female images in the book of Revelation as well. And the book is not totally anti-woman. We find some positive images in Revelation 12 and Revelation 19. Now, this brings me back around to a point that others have made quite well. This book is a hybrid piece of literature. As well as there being positive female images, there are negative male images in the book. The red dragon in Revelation 12, the false prophet in Revelation 16 and 19, and of course, the ever-present figure of Satan in Revelation 20. This book is a hybrid piece of literature. And this gathering tonight has brought to my attention that the book is more complex in this degree, in this sense, than I realized before. I had realized that politically and economically and religiously, it was hybrid. But now I have to go back and look at the gender roles and examine them more closely. But before we go and get and beat up on old John too much, all of us presenters are also hybrids. We are hybrid presenters. All of us, as several of the speakers have stated quite well, we all have identities in one social strata and identities in another. And quite frankly, I think this is one of the things about my own social location that keeps me grounded and centered. I don't get too far from my community, and my community doesn't get too far from me. I'll give you two examples of hybridity. One example is the emphasis upon methodology. The emphasis upon methodology in biblical studies is a Eurocentric emphasis. If not, we could probably get even more specific than that and say it's German. You know, if we're going to talk about social location on the one hand, which many of us in the African-American scholarly community do, I think we also need to be sensitive to the fact that social location is very, very dominant. And often the social location overwhelms the methodology. Let me give you one example. When James Halcone wrote his early work, he was without a doubt a bona fide neo-Barthian. A bona fide neo-Barthian. And he and J.D. Otis Roberts argued for years about methodology. And Roberts pointed his finger at him and said, "You are a Neo-Bardian." And Combs said, "Yes, I am. I did it this way because I knew if I did, people understand what I'm doing." But it was Combs' social location that made him the scholar that he was. Secondly, we construct our arguments in a very Eurocentric way. I wrote something recently, and I was writing for an editor, and the editor sent it back to me and asked me to rewrite it. He didn't ask me to change the content. He asked me to rearrange the content. That's just one example of where we are. But I want to thank Dr. Smith for Dr. Missy Smith for asking me to be on this panel, and I have learned a great deal. Thank you so very much.
We can't hear you. Oh, sorry.
I had kept it on and then all of a sudden I turned it off. Okay, so I'd like to invite our audience to put their questions in the chat box. I thank all of you. We've learned quite a bit, and I'd like to start with a couple of questions myself. So I'm wondering, when we talk about hybridity, and especially when we talk about, you know, I am part Rome and I'm part this, right? Are we not, in a sense, reinscribing instead of really getting away from hybridity? Is there anything that's not hybrid, right? Rome is a hybrid. It was a hybrid empire. Would you agree? So first, if you respond to that part of my question, yeah. So to insist on that hybridity means I'm part this and part that, is it not also to ignore the fact that everything really, and even Rome in this case, is a hybrid?
In what ways are you thinking about Rome as a hybrid?
Rome loved Greek culture, promoted Greek culture. Rome was not necessarily an inventor, a creator of new things, right? So it's very much a hybrid empire, right? And not only that, you see things geographically too. Yeah.
That sounds very familiar.
So my question is, if we start talking about reading Revelation as if I'm part Rome and I'm part this, are we not reinscribing and ignoring the hybridities that already exist there?
For me, when I think about Rome being a hybrid, I honestly don't think of Rome being a hybrid in terms of even the use of Greek culture, because I think that Rome has this air about itself that even though it is using part of Greek's culture, that is their right to do so, right? It's kind of like where I hear, you know, white America using or taking, you know, Black culture and assuming it as its own, right? There's no I guess, credit given to where you're getting your culture from. Same thing with Rome. Like and you all Revelation scholars can correct me if I'm wrong, but I haven't read anything where it said as though Rome, although we know, you know, they use Hellenistic, right? They use the Greek culture, but I think that Rome is so conceited, if I can say that, right? That they think that it's their right to take whatever they want. But I understand the hybridness in terms of, yes, they do use Greek culture. They do, you know, use all of that. But at the same time, I think that they're thinking that they're number one prevents them from claiming that on its own, if that makes sense.
Okay, so I want to push you, and I hope somebody else has a response too, because how do you not be shaped? How is it that you cannot be shaped by a cult, even if you deny it? You can be as arrogant as you want. It doesn't mean that you are not shaped.
Oh, I'm not saying that.
Right?
I agree with that. I believe that they are. I just don't think they would admit to it.
So that's not my question. My question
okay, so what is your question?
Is it in fact hybrid? Right?
Oh, yeah. In terms of culture.
I see Raj, your microphone is off. Are you trying to answer?
Oh, no.
No more responses?
I can. I thought Jackie was trying to respond. Right?
Oh, Jackie.
I mean, I think maybe I would want to know more. I mean, so there are definitely different conversations to be had about this is maybe one of the flaws or the challenges of the idea of hybridity itself, right? So if you take it as a generic, everybody's mixed, and it's frustrating that it always seems to feel incumbent upon the minoritized folk to point out their mixedness as a way of trying to remind the dominating folk that they too are mixed. They are not pure, when precisely their self-myths often rely on purity. So like there's this one way of thinking about hybridity. But I think there's also this other issue that is at stake in different discourses around mixedness, and that's how you understand the power dynamics shaping particular forms of hybridity. And I think that's part of what Shanell, you were pointing to. But I also, for me, I think drawing on what Dr. Darden pointed to in her work, it's more about us needing to grapple with the ways that we can't necessarily escape the things that we critique because we're enmeshed in them. Even as I think what you're pointing to, Rome cannot escape the influence of the minoritized subjects it dominated, right? But the colonized subjects, but we can't escape the influence of the worlds we critique. So as I'm sort of wondering, what difference does it make to you to know that Rome was also hybrid?
Yes. So, those are great questions. Thank you. So one of the ways I was thinking about this and thinking about a recent interview with Abraham Kennedy, right? Which he talked about the ways we all are shaped by racism, right? And we like to see it as only white people as shaped by racism, right? But we all are, to use that language. And he talked about the ways that he had to reflect on the ways he had been. For example, if a relationship with a Black woman went wrong, we're all Black women, right? And how racism shapes us to also, as people of color, as Black people, more specifically, also inscribed some of those very ideas or stereotypes and so forth. We are shaped by them too, and we reenact them and perform them. Right?
Yeah.
But if we're not aware of that, right, it becomes a problem. And it also gets at even notions of solidarity, right? Trying to become a collective. So just trying to get at the fact that there is more complexity there, right? That we can encourage ourselves to ignore, right? So we have a question from the audience, and then I'll ask my other question.
Can I say something really quick?
Yes.
I'll keep it brief. I think when I think about my own hybridity, I'm thinking of the ways I simultaneously occupy the margin and the center.
Mm-hmm.
And I think every margin is potentially a center. Because I might be at the margins, but I also have power in relation to other. But I think every margin is potentially a center, also in the sense that margins often reinscribe the center at the margins by mimicking and in other ways. So in terms of maintaining solidarity, how do I avoid the re-inscribing the center at the margins? I think that's a question that I ask myself.
I want to ask a question quickly. Is this what John is doing, re-inscribing empire and his own vision of the future of the kingdom of God, the throne room and the New Jerusalem?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay.
That's a good question, but yeah. Think about that.
I think it's hard for him to get around it.
Yeah.
You know, because that's the power structure that he knows. He wants to, shall we say, baptize it, but you know, he can't do anything else.
Yeah.
Okay, so do we have a question from the audience, Rebecca?
I put them in your box.
Oh.
You check.
Okay, well, I don't know where that's at. Let me go with my next one. So I grew up, and many of us did, in very conservative backgrounds, right? I was an Adventist, and Revelation and Daniel was what we taught. It was what we did at evangelistic meetings. And so I was an expert in a fundamentalist reading of Revelation, right? So, but hearing Tina and some of some other comments of your comments, and thinking about the binaries and the monsters, right? The monsters and the angels, right? The monsters and the martyrs, the witnesses, right? So these binaries, and we used to focus quite a bit on this 1,000 years that the beast was locked up. Right? And this has me thinking about, where is mercy in Revelation? Do you see any mercy in Revelation? And if you can think about this beast being locked up, and this beast being, and so you have the beast is, of course, considered, we would probably consider in a very simplex reading, a non-hybrid being, right? And this beast, and that, I think we could have a conversation with mass incarceration around this, the depiction of the beast and being locked up and for 1,000 years, kind of an eternity, and the absence of, I'm trying to find it. Where is mercy in Revelation? Is there any mercy in Revelation?
Dr. Smith, you have a couple of questions here. One from Tina Pippin. Can you hear me? It says, what is the difference between the monsters and the angels? Thinking of the angel armies.
Okay. Any responses to the? So Tina, is that, did you put that out there before?
Yeah. Well, I'm just asking the question, where are the monsters? I think they're throughout the text.
Yeah, so these monsters, and then there's these angels, right? So we get these binaries, and the criminalization of the dragon and the beast, right? He was locked away. Is there any mercy in Revelation?
For whom?
For anybody.
And is there hope? I want to ask too, is there hope?
Is there hope? That's a good question. And I know we tend to run to, the hope is God is in control. But as you pointed out, this God is problematic, right? Can be very problematic, to say the least, right?
The difference between the monsters and the angels is that the angels never fight.
The angels never fight?
The angels never take up arms. For example, in Revelation 12, Satan is defeated by Michael and his angels, but they're defeated. They defeat Satan through the shedding of their blood.
Okay. So do you have any questions for, I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm not all of a sudden become a novice again, but I don't know where, Rebecca, you put those questions.
I can see, no, they're just
Doc, I've got a question for you from, and I'm sorry, I don't know the author of this question, but you'll know who you are. Question is, inasmuch as the book of Revelation is a text of terror, how can we go about the healing from the trauma we see in the book, the trauma inflicted by the misuse of the book, and how could that inform our seeking healing from the traumas of white supremacy? Quote, or in parenthesis, thinking about Resmas Menachem's book, My Grandmother's Hands. Anyone?
One of the things that I try to do in my book is demonstrate that there is hope, but I'm going uphill. I realize I'm going uphill, and I'm going uphill because the interpretation of the book, the way the book has been preached in our churches and often taught, is not an emphasis upon hope, but an emphasis upon judgment. Judgment is there. It is clearly there, but the book is not all about judgment.
I have a quote from Greta Thunberg, you know, the youth eco-activist, who says, adults keep saying, we owe it to the young people to give them hope, but I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to react as if our house is on fire, because it is. And that quote is used, I want to recommend this book. It's just came out, Notes from an Apocalypse. Nice. He goes to different places to seek out apocalypse, which is everywhere. But so, you know, are we supposed to, you know, the book of Revelation in the Episcopal Church was only the heavenly throne room in the lectionary, because, you know, the B side was not there. We don't do blood and guts too well at Sherry Hour, right? And so, you know, we all kind of nod at this book, right? But, you know, we should be in panic. And I'm thinking of a story, the Reverend Ed Loring of the Open Door community that used to be in Atlanta and now it's in Baltimore, Maryland. There was a mobile Stations of the Cross in downtown Atlanta. It was done by Concerned Black Clergy, and Reverend Timothy McDonald, great preacher of First Iconium Baptist Church, was doing this fantastic litany of the issues in Atlanta. So many homeless, so many incarcerated, you know, this and that. And, you know, all the good liberals were, you know. Well, Ed Loring, who calls himself Ed the Agitator, was in the back yelling at the top of his lungs, my God, you know, and that seemed to be the appropriate response. And with the book of Revelation, we're all like, how do we make this work? How do we bring it into the canon and have this holistic thing that we can stomach? And maybe it's a text we stand up to in different ways.
Yeah, I like that quote because I kept asking when we as Black people will become enraged at the injustices. So despite pandemic, and I do think, I don't in any way glorify so many of us dying disproportionately from this pandemic, but if these recent deaths had not, well, let me put it this way, because of these recent deaths and the intersection of pandemic, there can be so many people in the streets. protesting. There can be. And so I kept asking when, sometimes we're asking how long, oh Lord, and we're asking God how long, but we need to be asking ourselves, how long will we stomach this, right? How long, when will we become enraged enough to act? Did I see Jackie? Yes.
Yeah, I just want to go back a little bit to say, to thank Tina for sharing the quote from Greta, and actually that I think it has a strange resonance with the Book of Revelation, precisely because it's a book that does not use the word for hope anywhere in its text, believe it or not. So it's an ironic resonance, and it's something that I thought about when I saw Theater Me Too's performance of Juarez, a documentary mythology, in December 2016, and it had an interview, it portrayed a bunch of interviews, and one of the activists basically said that that the situation has become too dire for hope. All that remains is determination. And I think that there is a way in which that you see that in the Book of Revelation with its emphasis on persistence of some sort. Now, I'm not using that as a way to try to recuperate Revelation, but I think it's an interesting resonance. But I think part of what I appreciated, Dr. Smith, Mitzi Smith, what you were pointing us to is the way that I think other people try to think about this is that it's not enough to try to reread things or read things differently. We have to move differently. We have to do things.
Yes, thank you. So thank you, everybody. Our time is out. Unless anybody has a final word they'd like to say. And I am appreciative of everyone who participated tonight and your expertise and wisdom that you all shared as individuals in the different ways that you came. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, our audience, for being with us tonight. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much for this.